Thanks so much for having me here to speak. It's quite an honor to be invited here. It helps knowing the rabbi. So U.S.-Israel relations. The name of today's talk is Where Are We? How did we get here? And where are we headed? The discussions over probably no country in the world are so charged or polarizing, exciting, or infuriating, depending on where you sit, as those on Israel. And no relationship between two countries is probably so closely scrutinized, for good or bad, as that between the United States and Israel. For those who follow and care about this relationship, the past 8 years have been a little challenging, right? Many feel that the United States, led by President Obama, has sort of deserted Israel, right? There's constant headbutting over things like settlement building or the lack of negotiations with the Palestinians. People are upset about the refusal to condemn terrorist attacks in Jerusalem, like terrorist attacks in Paris or Orlando. And of course, the Iran deal that was seen as sort of a low point in relations between the two countries recently. Of course, it usually takes two to tango. Israel, too, under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has also been accused of provoking or disrespecting President Obama. Right? There's been announcements regarding settlement expansion during Vice President Biden's one of his trips to Israel, or worst of all, when Prime Minister Netanyahu came and gave this sort of brazen speech to Congress, which was not coordinated with the White House. And so the question begs, where is this relationship today? How did it get there? And where are we headed? Now, many claim that the relationship between the two countries might be fraying. But the question is, have relations always been so close? And it might surprise you to know that not really. So I want to take you back to 1948, to a fascinating debate that raged in the White House. We're then going to jump to the height of the Cold War and a crucial turning point in U.S.-Israel relations. And using these two events as examples, I want to explore the origins of the U.S.-Israel relationship. We'll then skip to more modern times, and we'll examine what the U.S.-Israel relationship looks like today, from military, diplomatic, economic, technological, medical, and of course even cultural aspects. And lastly, I want to talk about where this relationship seems to be headed, as there are some trends and factors affecting this, from demographic trends in both countries and how they shape the bipartisan support for Israel in America, to more general but significant evolution of American foreign policy as the international system around us is also changing. Sounds ambitious, right? All right, so let's get going. 1948, just a few days before Israel is set to announce its independence, President Truman's not sure what he's going to do. His gut tells him that he needs to recognize and support the soon-to-be declared Jewish state. It doesn't even have a name yet. But his entire team of foreign policy advisors is dead set against it. George Marshall, right, the World War II hero, the general, and who Truman himself was called the greatest living American, was Secretary of State, completely against it. And so were all the big names of foreign policy at the time. James Forrestal, Secretary of Defense, Lovett, Akeson, George Kennan, Dean Rusk. You get the picture. So, in a heated debate about 2 days before, Secretary of Defense Forrestal at one point says, I'm quoting, "There are 30 million Arabs on one side, 600,000 Jews on the other. The Arabs are going to overwhelm the Jews. Why don't you face up to the realities? Just look at the numbers." He goes on to claim that if the U.S. supports Israel's independence, it's going to lose the support of the Arabs, Arab oil, and it's going to allow the Soviets to take over the Middle East. The State Department expected to lose their position entirely in the Arab world and felt that diplomatic missions would be in jeopardy. And of course, Marshall even accused the president of supporting Jewish independence because of Jewish voters in America, as most Jews, of course, were and are Democrats. He even claimed that the new state would be infiltrated with communist agents. Now, on the other side of the debate was the president's counsel, a man named Clark Clifford. Now, recall Truman's gut is to recognize Israel. And so he asks Clifford to convince him and the others why that's a good idea. For Clifford and Truman, their moral and religious beliefs weighed heavy. Truman was said to detest intolerance in general, and he also believed that the United States and Great Britain had a responsibility to help create a Jewish state in Palestine. The Jews, in his view, had to have a safe haven after the Holocaust. It would be one small way to atone for, and I quote, the atrocities so vast as to stupefy the human mind. Now, Truman was also a strong Christian believer in the Bible, and he would often recite quotes in these meetings, such as from Deuteronomy, where God promises the land to the Jewish people. But besides the moral claim, Clifford also argued on the merits of national security. He said, in an area as unstable as the Middle East, where there's never even been a tradition of democracy, the U.S. should rush to support the establishment of one that could in the future become a reliable ally. And if the U.S. didn't recognize it, the Soviets would surely jump in and do so. And then Marshall drops his bomb. I'm quoting, "If you follow Clifford's advice, and if I were to vote in the election, I would vote against you." This is huge. The room goes silent. Remember what kind of figure Marshall is. Remember how much esteem he holds in the eyes of America, specifically in the eyes of President Truman. And if word of this got out, it could also make Truman lose the next election. So Truman had to be careful. He was, in the end, convinced by Clifford and stuck with his gut instinct to recognize Israel, but he couldn't in any way lose Marshall's support in the process. So they finally get Marshall to back down and at least not oppose the move. And indeed, only 11 minutes after Israel announces its independence and its name, America is the first country to recognize it. And for that day at least, Truman and Clifford overcame the likes of Marshall and the rest. And as it turns out, nothing happened to America's relations with the Arab world. It's said years later, when Truman would meet Israel's first and founding prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, and Ben-Gurion related to Truman that it was his sympathy and courage to recognize and support Israel that gave him an immortal place in Jewish history. Truman was said to have been moved to tears. However, after recognizing Israel, and without the support of literally anybody in the American foreign policy establishment, the U.S. would practically revert to the other school of thought. Now, aside from the initial recognition and some foreign policy aid, the U.S. would maintain some distance from Israel over the next few decades. It refused to sell it arms that it crucially needed in its war of independence in its early vulnerable years. President Eisenhower and administration would deliberately create distance from Israel during his administration. And it wasn't really until the time of President Kennedy and later Johnson that the U.S. would even begin to sell arms to Israel. And it wasn't really until the time of Reagan that a strategic alliance was formed in the way we know it today. So this means, and it seems counterintuitive to probably most of us who see how close and deep this relationship is today, that it wasn't always so. So I want to take a step back and answer two big questions. Why did President Truman recognize Israel if all his major foreign policy advisors were against it? And then why would it take another few decades for this relationship to really begin to fill itself out? So the first answer is that Zionism, right, the belief of the Jewish return to Israel, as promised in the Bible, has some pretty deep roots in the American Protestant tradition. America's founding story, right, is one coming from oppression to find a new world, to establish a country that serves as a light unto the nations. That resonated, and at times even consciously mimicked the story of the ancient Hebrews, who came out of slavery in Egypt, who received the Torah, the Bible, who were promised the land of Israel, who conquered it from the Canaanites, and would establish what's supposed to be a model society. And these mythic and romantic beliefs of America for so many generations endured, took a life of their own. Like the ancient Hebrews, Americans believe, and many still do, that theirs is a revelation that's ultimately not just for them, but the whole world. The new Israel. And so there was a kinship, one chosen people to another. The U.S. protecting the Jews and Israel as two unique peoples blessed by God. One brought forth monotheism to the world, the other the new religion of democracy and liberty. At about this time, many pious Americans, so we're talking 1700s, 1800s, many pious Americans who read the Bible, they pictured a magnificent and fertile land, right? One flowing with milk and honey, as we read. But as travelers from America actually began visiting the Holy Land, they saw or heard reports of a barren wasteland, right? The most backwater, dusty, desolate parts of the even more backwards Ottoman Empire at the time. And in their minds, it was because the Jews were in exile. What they saw only reinforced this belief. The Holy Land and the Jews would never bloom until one returned to the other. And so, as Jews actually began returning to Ottoman Palestine in the 1800s, late 1800s, and early 1900s, settling the land, braving the elements, drying the swamps, defending themselves, this story, this ethos, would ring a bell with America, built on a similar ethos of settling the West and shaping its own destiny. And so in 1948, Americans watched as the most wretched and oppressed people on the earth who just survived the Holocaust made the desert bloom, built a democracy, defeated these larger and stronger Arab armies. Surely, this was proof of their own ideals and of God's support for this. And of course, Truman is a religious man. As I said, he read the Bible. He often quoted it in meetings. And after recognizing the new Jewish state, he compared himself to the ancient Persian king of biblical times who allowed the Jews to return to Zion. When thanked for his help in creating Israel, he replied, "What do you mean helped? I am Cyrus." Just some examples of how deep these roots are. I found these fascinating. John Adams once wrote, "I really wish the Jews again in Judea, an independent nation." To Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, "The Hebrews have done more to civilize man than any other nation." Abraham Lincoln, when meeting a Christian Zionist who expressed his hope to restore the Jews to their national home in Palestine, said, "It's a noble dream, one shared by many Americans." After a series of anti-Jewish pogroms, violence in Russia in the late 1800s, hundreds of prominent Americans backed a petition calling for the first international conference to consider, and I quote, "to consider Israelite claims to Palestine as their ancient home, where according to God's distribution of nations, it is their home, an inalienable possession from which they were expelled by force." They go on, "We believe this is an appropriate time for all nations to show kindness to Israel. Let us now restore them to the land of which they were so cruelly despoiled by our Roman ancestors." And this was 6 years before the World Zionist Congress, right, where political Zionism would be formed. Woodrow Wilson, Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding, Herbert Hoover, they all recognized the Hebrew contribution to American democracy, Western civilization, and all expressed their hopes of a Jewish homeland renewed in Palestine. Congress, in a joint congressional resolution in 1922, and again later in 1944, would endorse the Balfour Declaration. That was the British statement of support for a Jewish home and then British Palestine. I'll quote the congressional statement. "The Jews of America are profoundly interested in establishing a national home in the ancient land for their race. Indeed, this is the ideal of the Jewish people everywhere, for despite their dispersion, Palestine has been the object of their veneration since they were expelled by the Romans. For generations, they have prayed for their return to Zionism. And during the past century, this prayer has assumed practical form." Even more examples. The original design, I don't know if you knew this, for the official seal of the United States actually showed the Israelites crossing the Red Sea with Pharaoh in pursuit. The Liberty Bell is proclaimed with a quote from Leviticus, "Proclaim freedom throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof." Early American universities, right, Yale, Columbia, Dartmouth, Harvard, Princeton, all required Hebrew studies. And to this day, Yale's insignia is inscribed with Hebrew letters. Across America, there's 1,000 cities and towns. All have their names directly from the Bible. Here in Indiana, there's Goshen, Hebron, Lebanon, Salem. Over in Illinois, there's 2 cities named Zion. Georgia has a Bethlehem. Jerusalem, New York. In Maryland, there's a city called Rehoboth, named after the city where I live in Israel, Rehoboth. So when Truman would support Israel, he made that decision to support and recognize Israel, it was with all this behind him, right? The American Protestant Zionist tradition, a strong humanitarian impulse after the Holocaust, Jewish voters, African American voters, generally progressive voters from all over America, backing his brave decision that he would make. But let's look at the other side of the coin, right? The one that didn't want to recognize Israel and turn a cold shoulder for decades to come. So we recall Marshall and Forrestal and all the rest who thought it would be a mistake, folly, to support Israel lest they lose the Arabs. Well, around the 1960s, this same circle of what we call realist foreign policy influencers began to look at Israel a little differently. Israel's impressive military victories in 1956 and especially 1967 showed that the new Jewish state was a rising regional powerhouse despite its relatively small size. And at the same time, the Soviet influence in the Middle East, along with pan-Arab nationalism, were on the rise. So within a short span, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, the Arab powers at the time, rejected American influence despite all their efforts and embraced pan-Arabism and jumped under the Soviet umbrella in this sort of giant anti-West, anti-American coalition. And so now all of a sudden, an Israel that it turns out can actually fight fits into this new American strategy for the Middle East to contain the Soviets. And the US decided to shift its strategy and make an anti-Soviet bloc, which would include countries like Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, pre-1979 Iran, and Turkey. And of course, of all these, Israel is the only democracy. So this began with US arms sales, at first defensive weapons in the early 60s. By the late 60s, the fighter jets and more heavy weapons. And by 1973, by Israel's war in 1973, the Israel Defense Forces was primarily a US-built and supplied military. And of course, Israel, for its part, has always had to depend on an outside power, being surrounded by enemies. So if at first this was actually the Soviets through Czechoslovakia and later France, who better than the United States, right? The superpower who actually turned out to care about Israel. So I'm going to stop here, and now we're going to look at what this relationship looks like today. Well, we know there's a military component, and having had the honor of taking an active role in shaping that over the years, I can say that it's certainly stronger than any other relationship Israel has. And from what I've seen and what I've heard, it's deeper than anything America has either. And I said arms sales began in the 1960s. But the relationship didn't really take off in a structured fashion until the 1980s under President Reagan. So 1981, the first military agreements were being signed. By 1984, there were already joint military exercises. By 1985 is when we started the first massive $3 billion a year in military aid. By 1987, Israel's designated a major non-NATO ally, right? For a country that's not NATO, that's the highest kind of alliance you can achieve with the United States. To date, the United States has given Israel over $130 billion in foreign and defense aid since 1949, the vast majority of it being since the 80s, and used to purchase American arms. And if you've read the news recently, the two countries are looking to sign the next 10 years of this defense aid. That's how these are structured, 10-year agreements. So from 2018 to 2027, and they're actually looking to increase the defense aid to around $3.5 billion a year. The one hiccup right now that's preventing it from being signed is that the US is pushing to make sure all of it is spent in the United States. And Israel wants to maintain the current level where 3/4 of it is spent in the United States and 1/4 of it is spent in Israel. And this aid, even though many, including in Israel, ask why we even need this aid today, right? Israel's got a powerful economy, it's got a first-class arms industry. Well, even though the aid comprises much less of Israel's GDP, at one point it was 20% of Israel's GDP, now it's about 1%. And of course, Israel is now a major economy, where it didn't used to be. It's important for a whole number of other reasons. First, I think most importantly, is that it's the single greatest show of force that the United States stands by Israel. It's invested. It's not going anywhere. And this is very important in the Middle East, where these kind of actions can speak louder than any kind of speeches or statements. But moreover, while Israel's economy has grown, so have its threats and its defense budget. Today, Israel's defense budget is 5.6% of GDP, the highest portion of GDP of any country in the Western world. And so it's got a total defense budget of $15 billion a year. $3 billion of that are from U.S. defense aid. It's still a pretty significant number. Now back to the cooperation between the two. There's joint exercises. There's learning from each other's tactics and strategies. And remember, unlike other American allies, the cooperation only really started when Israel soundly defeated two much larger Soviet-made armies in 6 days. Now, the U.S. at this point had never engaged Soviet weapons or armies in battle, so this provided two very crucial advantages for the United States. It was able to see which battle tactics were best against Soviet-modeled militaries, and it could physically examine Russian arms that were captured by Israel. Just for example, after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the U.S. sent over a general to learn Israel's new, innovative combined arms doctrine. So this is an air-land battle doctrine that used tanks and planes together simultaneously. Nobody else was doing this. And the lessons that this general learned would help shape the American combat doctrine for years to come. And since then, the Air Forces, the Armies, the Navy, Special Forces all conduct training sessions together on a regular basis for years. As American troops were flying over to Iraq or Afghanistan, they would stop for training in Israel, as regrettably Israel has many years of experience fighting in Arab cities. And of course, as the U.S. gained experience in those places, it would come back and share those lessons with Israel. Another example is combating IEDs, improvised explosive devices, probably the single biggest killer of American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan during those two wars. Something else that Israel, sadly, has a lot of experience in. And so this is another area where the cooperation and Israeli experience between the two would save countless American lives. There's also incredibly close intelligence cooperation. So, as my mother mentioned, I served for a few years as an intelligence officer, and I'd meet my American counterparts on a monthly, sometimes even more frequent basis. I was surprised to learn that the cooperation was so close that we even share the raw intel. That's the really juicy stuff. And both countries have developed unique advantages in certain areas of intelligence over the years. This sharing serves quite well to both sides' advantage. Perhaps the most developed area of cooperation is in developing and testing new arms. Research and development on missile defense is probably some of the closest and most important cooperation between the two countries. And Israel today has some of the most advanced efforts in this field. From the Arrow, the Iron Dome, and soon the David Sling, if you've heard any of these talked about in the news, while the U.S. together simultaneously has developed the THAAD and soon the Patriot 3. The U.S. funds a lot of Israel's efforts in this field. And currently, this is the only area in which the U.S. will actually send troops to fight by Israel's side should it need it. Just as an aside, during the major exercise we had with American troops to specifically drill missile defense, the United States sent over a 4-star general, the commander of all American forces in Europe, and I had the honor of accompanying him as we toured the various segments of the drill, of the exercise. And what I saw was that American and Israeli soldiers and officers literally sitting shoulder to shoulder, working on how this would play out in real life should we ever need it. And I saw a really deep and serious mutual commitment to one another from all levels, from the general and down to the lowest soldier. Now, just as probably all of Israel's threats are common to the US, whether now or later, all of this joint funding and research ultimately comes back and benefits the United States. Right now we have the threat of missiles from Iran and Israel, from North Korea and the United States. In the future, who knows? We could see a resurgent Russia or an aggressive China. The uses of missile defense are probably not going to go away anytime soon. Israel's currently facing terrorist tunnels in Gaza, so we're developing anti-tunnel capabilities, also partly funded by Congress. And this could eventually be useful in defending American bases or embassies abroad, or even on your own southern border. I could talk for hours, literally, just about all these different kind of things. And if anyone's interested about specifically missile defense or tunnels, I've published a few articles on them. They're on my website. QME. I don't know if any of you have heard of the term QME. So it refers to probably one of the most significant areas of cooperation, qualitative military edge. And that's a U.S. commitment that as it sells arms to the Middle East, it takes into account Israel's sensitivities. The U.S. commits to maintain Israel's, and I'll quote, ability to counter and defeat any credible conventional military threat from any individual state or possible coalition of states while sustaining minimal damages and casualties. It goes on. What this means is that in yearly meetings, which again partook in many and helped prepare from the Israeli side, representatives from both sides hold very honest, sometimes difficult discussions as to which arms the U.S. is ultimately going to sell to other countries in the Middle East, and which are too dangerous from Israel's perspective. This is one of the most crucial aspects of the cooperation that demonstrates just how close the two countries really are. But beyond the military, there's also very crucial diplomatic support for Israel at the United Nations. So American diplomats on a regular basis, in the face of daily attacks and anti-Israel resolutions coming mostly from a pretty biased Arab and Muslim bloc of nations. And this is most important in the Security Council, where the decisions are binding and where the U.S. has a veto. Many ask, it's a fair question, they ask in Israel too, why should the U.S. keep giving Israel so much defense aid and even look to increase it, right? We said Israel's an economic power. Israel today, you see that the number, receives 50% of all U.S. defense aid in the world. Well, I'll answer this question in another way. As Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, once said, I'll quote him, Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world. It cannot be sunk, doesn't require even one American soldier, and is in a critical region for American national security. This is pretty true still today. Just so you have a counterexample, in 2015, the United States had 150,000 troops stationed in 800 bases in 80 countries around the world. 35,000 of them in 20 different Middle Eastern countries. Who wants to take a guess how much this costs you, the American taxpayer? Over $150 billion a year. Okay? And if we take out the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan out of the equation, it's still costing you $85 billion a year. Now, as I said, Israel has already proved itself as a powerful and reliable ally in the Cold War. And to this day, for the most part, the U.S. has never had to become directly involved in, call it, Israel's neck of the woods. The U.S. has had to go in and fight for Saudi Arabia, for Kuwait, right, to defend them from Iraq. In Korea, it'll probably likely have to physically go in where if the Gulf countries were ever attacked by Iran, or if Russia ever decided to invade Europe again. But Israel doesn't need and doesn't want American troops coming to its defense. So that $3 billion a year and access to the best American arms ensures that Israel can more than take care of itself and other U.S. allies around it. Think of it like outsourcing. And I already mentioned that Israel's intelligence and it's called them covert efforts, right, were and are key to dealing with many of these shared threats, from radical Islam and preventing the proliferation of WMD, right? Places like Iraq and Syria, Iran. Secondly, as I've noted, most of that money, soon maybe even all of it, goes right back to American defense manufacturers, back to the American economy, creating jobs for Americans. Third, money buys influence. That's how superpowers work. And it means that Israel has to listen to the U.S. and accept its leadership role in the region and the world. Fourth, I've mentioned this, Israel is like a living military laboratory, as it tends to meet many of the threats that the U.S. eventually has to face first. So new battle concepts are developed, new arms are developed, and we can't talk enough about Israeli innovation as far as arms manufacturing. Again, all of which is fully shared with the United States. So I've mentioned missile defense, tunnel defense is next, but Israel is also a leader in drone technology, something that the U.S. currently relies on quite heavily. It's also developed the most advanced APC, that's armored personnel carrier, to make a tank without moving gun, right? And that's being produced in Michigan. It also produces much of the advanced avionics, right, all the electronics that match up with U.S. fighter jets. And it's even developed an active defense system for tanks and APCs, which can shoot down enemy rockets fired at those, right? All of which it shares with the U.S., and all of which could save, and do save, thousands of American lives. More than that, out of the innovative atmosphere sparked by the military, Israel has generally become a knowledge and innovation powerhouse. So much so that Google CEO Eric Schmidt recently said that Israeli innovation is second in the world, only to Silicon Valley. All sorts of fields, from high-tech, medicine, science, agriculture, water technology, cybersecurity, pretty important today. Israel's become a world leader, the fruits of which, spurred by this defense aid, all go back to directly help the United States. I'll give you an example. In 2014, Israel accounted for 10% of global investments in cybersecurity. By 2015, the next year, that jumped to 20%. And keep in mind that Israel makes up 1/10 of 1% of the world's population. And that's a pretty crucial field today, cybersecurity, right? It's no wonder that companies like Intel, Microsoft, Google, Apple, HP, PayPal, I could name many more, have their R&D centers in Israel. And all of the innovation goes right back to the American economy. I mentioned water. So if in the past, Israel was chronically short of water, today, through advances in desalination and water recycling, Israel recycles, desalinates 90% of its water. That's the highest level in the world. So wars started over scarce water resources, including some of Israel's wars, are a thing of the past. And today, Israeli water experts are in California trying to help them with their drought. But even more than that, a lot of these innovations are then further developed and manufactured right here in the United States, where there are currently over 1,000 companies operating in 40 states, which have created over 100,000 American jobs. Trade with Israel, just 3% of the Middle East, accounts for 25% of U.S. exports to the region, and bilateral trade between the two countries today is at $40 billion a year and growing. I mentioned we can talk about Israeli medical innovations, right? Groundbreaking academic research, or how many leading Israeli professors also teach at American universities. We can talk about culture. American television, movies, books, music are widely popular and profitable in Israel. But also, a large number of Israeli TV shows were bought out by American producers and remade for your viewing pleasure. You saw Homeland, right? So we can see that while, of course, these relations will never be equal, right? The relations between a superpower and a local power are never going to be equal. The U.S. clearly gets a lot out of its $3 billion a year investment. That's the fun part. Now let's get into the complicated part. Things are changing, and they have been for some time. And it's important to try to understand why that is. So I wanted to briefly touch on what I see as two major factors shaping on shaping how this relationship is currently changing and maybe explain why we've seen some tensions over the past 8 years. So the first is that societal and demographic changes are affecting the bipartisan status of Israel in America. Now, we mentioned that it was the Democrats who originally supported Israel, and the Republicans who originally wanted nothing to do with Israel, right? But if we look from today's perspective, it seems the roles have reversed. We can almost take for granted that support for Israel is a sure thing in the GOP, and many people are starting to accept as a done deal that the Democrats are finished with the idea of Israel, for some exaggerating for the sake of this talk. But in the eyes of many people, Israel has become a partisan issue, and groups like AIPAC and other pro-Israel groups are working hard to reclaim this bipartisan status. So let's quickly take a look at how this happened. So if we look at the Republican Party, so in addition to the strategic Cold War considerations that we talked about, the GOP would soon become influenced heavily by two key groups, neoconservatives and evangelicals. In the 1970s, we saw the rise and the influence of a more moralist and aggressive foreign policy approach in the United States, geared towards the Soviet Union, but by extension also the nationalist Arab states, right, the Arab dictators, who were part of the Soviet sphere. And a whole cadre of influential foreign policy thinkers grew up. They were younger at the time. Today they're a little older, under the likes of people like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, right, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who fought the Zionism as racism declaration in '75, or Congressman Henry Scoop Jackson, who used his congressional power to pressure the Soviets to release Jews who wanted to emigrate. Now, although they were originally Democrats, they would have a lot of influence on Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. And later on, they would actually move over to the Republican Party, becoming especially dominant in that party's foreign policy by the time of Bill Clinton, especially George W. Bush. The 70s also saw the rise of evangelical Christians in America, right? First in society and later in politics, with a fierce religiously inspired support for Israel. And this group would soon emerge as the largest voting bloc in the GOP base. So with these forces coming together in the 70s and into the 80s, Ronald Reagan, the Republican, would become the first truly pro-Israel president. Now sure, not everything he did was in Israel's interest. You know, he criticized Israeli moves such as attacking the nuclear reactor in Iraq, or Israel's invasion of Lebanon, or selling advanced arms to Saudi Arabia. But overall, in his worldview, he saw Israel as a key member and a direct representative in the Middle East of a coalition of free countries in the struggle against totalitarianism and authoritarianism. Now, George Bush, the dad, right, was sort of a return to that country club Republican realist, right, that were distant from Israel. But by the time of his presidency, it was clear that his foreign policy thinking was a little outdated within the larger Republican Party. And by the time of the 9/11 attacks at the start of Bush Jr.'s term, the United States would personally come face to face with the horrors of Islamic terror at the same time that Israel was facing the Second Intifada and its own slew of suicide attacks, which further strengthened the view that the U.S. and Israel shared a deep connection as far as their place in the world. Now, the Democrats are a bit more of a mixed picture. The key change in the Democratic Party in Israel can be explained by the rise of what we call the New Left in U.S. intellectual thought that came up during the Vietnam War. So these sort of intellectual schools rooted in communism, like post-colonialism, post-nationalism, post-modernism, right? And people like George McGovern, and later Jimmy Carter, can be seen as sort of symbolic of this shift within the Democratic Party. And Carter's presidency would coincide with the key shift in Israel's electoral and demographic picture. The election of Menachem Begin, the first right-winger elected to power in Israel. And he came to power on the base of a more religious, more Sephardic, people know what that means, that's of Middle Eastern as opposed to European origin Jews, right? And of course, a more right-wing base. Now, 1982, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and later the outbreak of the first Palestinian uprising, the Intifada in 1987, were heavily covered in the media. And for the first time, they paint this picture of Israel as a regional bully and an aggressor. And this kind of helped cement the Palestinian narrative of David versus Goliath. But this time, Israel is Goliath, not David. And that's something that American liberals, many American liberals at the time, could connect with. Now, if we talked about George Bush the dad as sort of the non-pro-Israel anomaly in the changing Republican Party, we can look at Bill Clinton in many ways as a return to the classical pro-Israel Democratic Party role. But the 1990s also saw the failure of the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. It also saw the rise of Benjamin Netanyahu and the return of the Israeli right to power. It saw the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin by a right-wing Jew. And all these further increased American liberal frustrations with Israel. And despite that Clinton clearly blamed Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinians, for the failure of the peace talks, the hard left in the United States would increasingly blame Israel for this. And then the second Intifada, the second Palestinian uprising, hundreds of suicide bombings, terrorist attacks, over 1,000 Israelis murdered between 2000 and 2003, should have shown this group of American liberals that the Palestinians were not interested in peace, rather than destroying Israel. But it only further cemented that view of the David-Goliath narrative in their minds. And of course, this same second Intifada decimated the Israeli left, the Israeli pro-peace camp, further increasing the gap between the American left, which is growing, and the new Israeli right, which was also growing. So as this view of Israel solidified, Israel's legitimacy, we can say, became increasingly dependent on having to make peace, at least in the eyes of liberal Democrats. Now, if we move forward to today, I think the recent Democratic and Republican Party platforms, as far as Israel is concerned, are telling of where things may be headed. Right, so Bernie Sanders pushed to have 3 known, highly anti-Israel people on the committee, and wanted to push for a more critical approach. In the end, though, the party platform came out pretty balanced on Israel, supported a 2-state solution, thanks to Hillary Clinton and her influence. Also, interestingly, for the first time, the GOP platform didn't mention the 2-state solution, and it took a hard pro-Israel. This might be telling of where things may be going with the two parties. Now, we'll talk a second about demographic shifts, too. So, the influence of demographic changes also can't be ignored, especially as far as younger Democratic voters. Today, younger Americans are far removed from the memories of the Holocaust or from Israel's founding in 1948. They can't remember a time when Israel was weak and threatened. They're also more prone to this universalist worldview that celebrates the global citizen, tearing down borders, tearing down national identities. And possibly more importantly, America is becoming more secular, more ethnically diverse. And that means that traditional support for Israel in America, based on a Judeo-Christian worldview, is just not as widespread as it was in previous generations. And we also can't ignore demographic changes in Israel, as Israel, by all accounts, is becoming more religious, more right-wing, and more nationalistic, a trend that's clearly at odds with the trend that's happening here in America. But I don't want to be too alarmist, although it makes for good headlines. So I'll give you just some precise numbers on American support for Israel. 70% of Americans today support Israel. 62% say they support Israel more than they do the Palestinians. And these numbers, and I went back, these numbers have been consistent and even growing over the years. They're actually the highest they've ever been. Now, it's true, conservatives today support Israel more than liberals. Younger Americans support Israel less than do older Americans. African Americans and Hispanics also support Israel less than do white Americans. But for the most part, Americans still support Israel. More Americans support Israel than not. So, while America is still massively supportive of Israel, perhaps, like I said, more than ever, the demographic cracks in that armor might be beginning to show around the edges. And these could be a sign of things to come. For those people who are interested, I have very detailed breakdowns of all of these. I ran them recently. They're quite interesting and happy to share them. So where are things going? Last thing I want to discuss is how the shifting world order is affecting American foreign policy priorities, including its relationship with Israel. So as we learned, the relationship was not always so close, and it only became so when the strategic aligned with the domestic, when the Cold War reality and Israel's wars with the Arabs caused U.S. strategic interests to align with Israel's, and where the domestic affinity for Israel in America already existed. The Cold War is long over. Now, 9/11, the war on terror, Iraq, and Iran sort of distracted America and all the major powers from this reality. But over the past few years, as the Iraq war kind of winded down, as negotiations advanced towards an Iran deal, the U.S. and President Obama began contemplating a new foreign policy for this new international order that's been shaping. America's failure to transform Afghanistan and Iraq into harmonious, liberal, Western-style democracies was really a bitter lesson in humility and the limitations of military power, despite having the strongest military ever assembled. And so what we're seeing is the emergence of what we're calling the Obama doctrine of foreign policy, and it's likely to stick around for the foreseeable future, or at least key elements of it. So for one, as President Obama has said himself, right, the leading principle is likely to be, don't do stupid stuff. He actually used a different word, but I'm censoring myself. Now, we can expect America to be far more hesitant using force. And the U.S. is likely to prefer to lead from behind, as President Obama himself said. It's going to offer intelligence, logistics, support, training, even airstrikes if needed. And that's exactly what happened in places like Syria and Yemen. But it's not going to rush in to get involved itself with boots on the ground as it has in the past. We can also expect a continued deference to international consensus, as we've seen in many of these places, and also opting for diplomacy over the use of force, as happened with Iran's nuclear program, Syria's chemical weapons. But what's worrying from the point of view of Israel and many of the U.S.'s allies is that it's becoming clear that the U.S. is trying to get out of the Middle East and pivot over to Asia. And this creates a vacuum, a power vacuum, that powers like Russia are rushing to fill. And that's a reality that's far less comfortable for Israel and the U.S.'s other allies. And so it was really the Iranian nuclear deal that exposed these shifts, right? The two countries, Israel and America's interests, were completely merged, identical as far as stopping Iran's nuclear program, until the negotiations actually started. And then the divergence would expose this shift. So for Israel, Iran today is the only strategic threat to its existence. Now, while few in Israel's security establishment actually think that Iran would launch a nuclear weapon at Israel if it had it, the possibility is always there, and that's a chance Israel just can't take. It's too small a country. But the United States has much more room for error with Iran than Israel does. Not to mention, it's got a whole list of other international threats with which it has to deal. And so the United States could settle for a deal that only delayed Iran's nuclear program, didn't stop it, and it also gave in to a number of last-minute Iranian demands that make life much harder for Israel and those other allies in the region. And above all, the sort of sneaking suspicion that in America's rush to get out of the Middle East, it might have been fine with letting Iran help shape a new regional order. Right? President Obama said in his big interview in The Atlantic that Saudi Arabia has to learn to share the region with Iran. Which is very worrying for a lot of countries in the region. And so that's why Netanyahu bet it all on trying to convince America and Congress to go against the deal. It failed, straining relations in the process. Now, from an American perspective, if this deal, if the nuclear agreement meets America's security demands, well, that's its prerogative, but it doesn't meet Israel's. And the problem a lot of Israel's supporters had, and maybe they didn't know to articulate, was that President Obama was trying to convince Americans, Israelis, and the world that this deal was in Israel's interest, and continued to claim that American support for Israel is rock solid and unshakable. This may have been the first time since the relations reached their peak levels that they came to a test, and where American interests diverged from those of Israel's. And of course, understandably, America decided to act in its own interest. And many Israel supporters, conversely, painted this deal, and anyone who supported it, as anti-Israel. But here's the thing, right? Not pro-Israel doesn't mean anti-Israel. We can't forget that President Obama has been entirely supportive of the overall strategic framework. He's increased funding and support for Israel's defense and intelligence. And he's about to sign off on another 10-year deal for military support that'll carry over into the next president, maybe the one after that, which ensures Israel's physical survival. And what this means is that the two countries might not agree on everything. That's fine. Not even the presidents that we remember as the most pro-Israel liked or agreed with every Israeli policy or decision. And when push came to shove, they generally acted first and foremost in America's interests. But even with the demographic and political shifts in both countries, right, and the changes in the international order, the U.S.-Israel relationship is one that's based on a foundation of common values, mutual interests, and a shared destiny as democracies in often hostile world. And over the years, it's become so deep, so structured, and so organic in so many areas that it's not likely to go anywhere, at least not in our lifetimes. As we've heard over the past hour, this relationship wasn't always great as or as bad as we think it is. And it's constantly developing, it's changing. Nobody can guarantee that it'll continue as we know. Another 10-year agreement on defense aid is crucial in booking the next decade, but things are going to change, or can change. Demographic, political, social trends, all these things I talked about, they're useful to study the past, maybe even try to guess where things are going, but they can never really predict the future. And by no means do the trends highlighted there translate into faith. For those who care about this relationship, as I do, and as I think most of you do, and for what both countries get out of it, it's imperative that we continue to work for it, fight for it, to educate our own, educate the broader public. This is, after all, a relationship that has been nothing but beneficial to America and nothing short of crucial to Israel.